Oh well, thanks for coming out. Today, as you've probably all seen, we're going to talk about a bit of typography and some of the theory and thoughts around how we can utilize type to communicate better and clearer, but also get a basic understanding of, I guess, what type is and how we can manipulate that. Yeah, so let's get into it. I'll just share my screen. So my last couple of tutorials have been a bit more like practical, and I've got you guys to work alongside me. But today I'm probably going to do, it's probably hopefully anyway going to be a bit more conversational, where you guys can basically ask questions, stop me at any time, and I'll just otherwise do some talking around type. So if that's cool with you, that's cool with me. So yeah, please talk as much as you want, ask me all the questions, and yeah, cool. So typography, first off, what is typography? Typography is the art and technique that consists of arranging type with the purpose of making language more visible. So the goal of typography is moving and sorting out letters and how words form and sit to best actually communicate what the words and letters are actually saying. So how we do that, we have things like a typeface, which is what these letters are here. Actually, we'll put a pause on that. I've got some more thoughts around typography first before we get into that. Typography, for me anyway, I reckon is one of the things that makes or breaks a piece of design. Usually its effects are barely ever visible or barely even noticed by the person reading it, but subconsciously it has the best and most biggest effect on how someone picks up and actually connects with the piece of design. So the goal of designers is to make, obviously, communication as clear and as best as possible between the reader and the viewer and the artwork or the design. And I'll talk briefly on that in the last tutorial, and I know Ben's kind of been touching on similar subject matter in terms of drawing and how we can best utilize that skill to communicate as best as we can. It's the same thing with typography for a designer. It's one of our best tools, I guess, we have in our kind of tool belt to actually clarify and communicate as best as possible with a piece of design. Just a brief type history. Type is something that's been around basically from as soon as humans have been around. Type, again, is just another way of communication, but it's just communication through symbols. So it is actually like related to pictures and drawings and things like that. Essentially, a letter is just a shape that we've assigned a message to or a sound to. And when we put together all these different shapes that are now being put together now have a meaning that we associate with them. And so just like a drawing and how you might see a picture of a bull, for example, we associate that picture with a bull. The same goes with letters. When we see a letter, we associate a meaning or a picture with that. And so typography is ingrained within type anyway, is ingrained within all of us and how we communicate and in our language. So it has been around since we've been around. But the art of typography and the art of arranging letters in a way to communicate as best as possible really became a thing when the letterpress was invented, which was, I think, in like the 1500s or something like that. And so the letterpress, if you don't know what a letterpress is, I'll quickly show you guys. So basically a letterpress was the thing that was the machine, I guess, that was able to mass produce newspapers, books, and became like the way that I guess was the invention anyway that revolutionized how we relate with written things. And so in this picture here, we can see these kind of plates that build up a page, and all these little shiny, sparkly things are individual letters. And so people who used to, and obviously you can see the printing up here, how type used to be done back in the old days when we used a letterpress, was that a type designer like this guy here would go through and lay out every single letter individually, like so, in a little metal block. But now, thank goodness, we have a computer which kind of does all that mechanic work for us, which we can just type in the keyboard, and all those letters get put in place into our block. And so obviously there are some principles within this images that these guys use in terms of letter spacing, line spacing, which we're going to get into today. So all the principles that we're going to touch on today became a thing and were created during this period where these guys would set letters into this letterpress. Is that cool? Sweet. So over time, when culture's kind of developed, we've, just through how books have been written and how the printing press created these newspapers and books, we've picked up a subconscious understanding and a subconscious, I guess, rules about how we read and how we interpret words. And so subconsciously, we've picked up, without obviously realizing, we've picked up rules that we abide to and that we understand without even realizing we understand, in terms of what makes things readable, what makes things clear, what's easier to read, what's easier on our eyes to read, what's harder on our eyes to read, what makes our eyes tired when we read a piece of a book. All these things can kind of be affected by how type is set, and purely based on history and how we've done it in the past. And so with typography, there are a few rules that actually make how you set type actually matter in terms of communicating the best message to the audience, because this audience, they actually do already abide by a rule when they actually interpret the type on a page. And so our job as a designer, obviously, is to try and abide by those rules and make how we format letters and how we format words as clear as possible through by abiding through those laws and using those rules to our advantage. And so that's the basis of typography. That's kind of what we're going to explore today, and we're going to explore how we can kind of use that to our advantage. But first, I kind of want to differentiate and go through some of the words that you might hear today, or that I might speak, or words that you might have heard before but not quite understand, and just build up a good library, I guess, of words and what they mean and how we can use that. So the first of that is typeface and font. You probably would have heard font more commonly used than typeface, but these actually, and if you have heard both of them, they've probably been used interchangeably as the same kind of thing. But first and foremost, I just want to establish that a font is a certain type of like style of type in a certain weight, whereas the typeface is that font but in all the weights, like so. And so you might have heard someone refer to all of Helvetica as a font, when really, in fact, it's a typeface. And if you were to refer to Helvetica bold, that would be the font. I mean, it's, who really cares at the end of the day, but just in case you wanted to be clarified on what's the difference between typeface and font, that's what it is. But you'll probably hear most people just referring to font, referring to a typeface as a font, which, to be honest, I don't really care. You can go for that as well. I do that as well. I'm guilty of that. But that's the difference between those two words, if you've ever heard those before. Now I just want to go over some of the styles of typefaces or fonts that you might have seen before. These are kind of like the four main styles. So every typeface that kind of exists mainly fits under these four categories. There are a few exceptions, and within these four categories, there's probably like 10 other subcategories or styles in each. Like, say for a sans serif, for example, there's probably like 10 other subclassifications within that. So style of sans serif. But I just want to touch on these today. So we've got the serif classification, the serif style. That refers to a typeface that has these little like notches that come out of it. And so most of the older fonts that were created in the Roman era, I guess, were this style that had these serifs. And so what serifs do, and how typographers kind of utilize the serif, is that our eyes actually created a wee link between these things, between the serifs, and it actually makes it easier for us to read. So if you've ever read a book that's been set in a serif, most of the time it's actually subconsciously you're easier to read than a book that was set in a sans serif. So that's a little fun fact about serifs. So serif, typeface just refers to a typeface that has these kind of notches here at the bottom and top in the typeface. A sans serif is obviously a typeface that is structured similar to that, but just doesn't have those little notches coming out on the top and bottom of the letter forms. Hence why it's called sans serif. Sans means none or no or lack of, and so that's how you can differentiate between those two classifications. This style you've probably seen lots lately. In the modern era, this has become quite a big thing. In the 1950s, I think the Swiss type designers began to explore it and create fonts and typefaces that were looked and functioned like these. And then since then, and even commonly, this is the kind of typeface that you will see most of the time and mostly used, purely because of its lack of flavor or flourish like this has. And so that we'll get to that later actually. So the other two styles here are script style. And so on Instagrams and on like Pinterest and stuff in the last 10 years, you would have seen like lots of this kind of style come to life. In the chat, Papyrus here, mate. Feel free to stop me. Feel free to stop me and ask questions.
That's the most beautiful font I've ever seen in my life.
I feel like the spirituality of this chat went up like double.
What's that?
The spiritual level in this chat went up like 2 times because of that papyrus.
It's true. And so so like this kind of style has become pretty popular in amongst our culture, I guess. But again, that's just another style of typeface which differs from these two. Way more hand-drawn, scripty kind of look to it. And then we have the classification of decorative, and so papyrus, which we all love to love, probably slots under. And so these things kind of can't really be classified into a sans serif or a serif in Sign Painter, so they kind of just fit into their own category of decorative.
Hey Joel.
Yeah, man.
You know how you talked about serif fonts kind of subconsciously link our eyes to making them read easier
between the serifs.
Is there anything within like the serif font or sans serif fonts or Sign Painter that are kind of like have that subconscious thing as well, or is it that just kind of just?
Well, I would say there probably is in terms of how these link up with this, but also the letter forms within a script font usually are a lot harder to distinguish. When you think of like a handwritten note compared to a typed out note, what's easier to read usually? Probably the typed out note, because it has less characteristics and more uniformity into it. Whereas script fonts usually have lots of weird things going on, like that R, for example, that doesn't look like the normal form of what an R kind of, R kind of looks like. And so it does take our brain a little bit longer to kind of pick up on. Yeah, for sure.
Cool.
But choice of font is like super important when you're actually doing the design, and choice of classification is super important, purely because of this, again, the effects that actually when we look at a typeface, it affects our emotions and affects how we interpret the whole design. And what I mean by that is when I look at something like a serif, for example, instantly these words and this half of the page looks a lot more formal and a lot more high class and elite, I'd say, more so than this half of the page does. And in this half of the page in the sans serif, I'd say these characters, they lack a lot more character and a lot more emotion than something like a serif does. Over here, it kind of, it reminds me of more, say, like a lawyer, someone who's like quite firm and potentially bland in their personality, whereas a Times New Roman might be someone who's like, I don't even know, something super fancy, and again, when we continue that down here, these script fonts are a lot less formal than something like a sans serif or even a serif, and a lot more loose and probably a lot more playful than some of these. So you can begin to get a lot more character come through in a script typeface. And the same could probably be said for a decorative typeface. These are, I'd say, are probably a lot more specific than the other three are. With decorative typefaces, you know, that has Papyrus, for example, has a definite feel to it. You look at that and you instantly go Egypt, and purely because of, I guess, the notches, the letter forms, but also because of when the style has kind of been used and when we've seen it throughout culture, it's been associated with the Egyptian culture. Does that kind of all make sense? So choice of typeface when we're considering our design is super important, purely because of the fact is whether we want it to be super readable, and that comes first in our decision making, or whether we want to portray certain emotions or feelings within our design. That might be the first thing that we're trying to consider. And so we need to take a conscious effort and a conscious decision when it comes to actually choosing a typeface and choosing what's going to best help communicate and help aid our design to tell its message. So that's the classifications of type. Now you can have a name to when you see a typeface like that. You can go, oh yeah, that's a serif typeface, and you can impress your friends. So that'll be cool. Good on you. Now I just want to briefly touch on some of the characteristics of a typeface and how we kind of go about in some of the language that a typographer might use. And so a typeface can be broken down in there's like four kind of main aspects to a typeface, and that is the baseline, which is this line here, which runs along the baseline of where all the letter forms kind of sit on. Then there's the X height, and the X height is this line here, which is where all the letter forms reach up to. We have the cap height, which is where the capitals reach up to, and then we have the ascender line, which is where all the ascenders ascender is the word that basically references the tails on the G and the Y, and the stems from the P's, everything that sits below the baseline. That's called an ascender. And so the ascending line is obviously the line where they all line up. And so how most typefaces this is where they get most of their differentiation between. So say if I was to grab a few of the typefaces within a sans serif. In fact, I might even do that real quickly. I might grab that, and I might grab let's go that guy. And so how the individual letter forms between these two typefaces are pretty similar, and because these are pretty similar, these are super similar actually in terms of typefaces. But what differentiates here is the X height, the ascension line, the cap height are all quite different in terms of where the thing sits. So we've got a bit more height coming in the X height. And so that's kind of how most of these, well, one way anyway, of how typefaces within a classification differentiate without just the letter forms being completely different. Is actually you can play around with where the X height kind of sits. And this, I'll touch briefly a bit more on this later when we get to look at paragraphs and how words kind of sit within a paragraph. Because by itself, when you see a word like this, it doesn't actually, you can't notice too much of a difference. But when I flick between a couple of typefaces, maybe later, how the X height and baseline and all that can affect a paragraph will come into play a bit more obviously.
Joe,
and so once, yeah, man.
Maybe not so much question, but do you think that maybe a bit later, right? Can you put two fonts that are like really similar, like Utilise and Helvetica, and like maybe from your opinion or whatever, like tell us why they had to create another one and what difference that, for example, the A is a bit different in Utilise and Helvetica. So why was that? Why did they have to create a new font for them? And why do you think there are so many similar fonts that to normal eyes look no different, but why did they have to build a whole new font out of that?
Yeah, it's a big question, but let's get into it. I'll get into it now, otherwise I'll forget about it. Yeah, where do we start with that? So Helvetica, which is this one here, that became basically this, like the top dog of all sans serifs and became the most common one. Arial is one that you might have on your computer and which you might be more familiar with, and that is basically a rip-off or a recreation of Helvetica. But Helvetica basically, yeah, like I said, became the poster boy, I guess, of the sans serifs, and that's because it I guess type designers found it, or after it was created, used it and realized that it had such a good universality in terms of use. Like you could use it anywhere and it would look good and it would make sense purely because of its perfect balance of lack of characteristic, but still showing a good amount of characteristic. And what I mean by that, when I say characteristic, is kind of, these flurries on the little A, where the C's kind of like break off in relation to its circle, how tight the E tail is actually to this line here of the E. Little subtle things like that, which made the typeface super readable, super usable, and so it just got used all the time. And so if you go outside tomorrow, if you go for a walk tomorrow, maybe, and like walk down the street, if you see a sans serif, it will probably most likely be Arial or Helvetica. And so what type designers, after that kind of Helvetica was used, it became so used that everyone was like kind of got bored of it. Or type designers did anyway, because they wanted something new, they wanted something fresh. But they also knew that how powerful and how usable and how good actually Helvetica looked. And so a typeface like Swiss probably used Helvetica as their starting point when they began to develop their typeface. They would have wanted for their typeface Swiss to be used in a similar way that Helvetica was, in terms of usability, in terms of how lack of character it does, so it doesn't bring its own message into the design, but also how much character it kind of possesses to actually add to the design, which is like the balance every designer is trying to get to. And so this would have been 100% based off Helvetica, and we can see that purely like in terms of like the C's look super similar. I'd say the gap there is probably a bit more, and they've used a bigger inner circle just to open that C up a bit more. The H, for example, I'd say the X height is a little bit taller all across this typeface than it is down here. Again, you've got a bit more roundness coming on into the individual letters than you do in Helvetica. See here, there's a bit of a flatness coming on the top here. They've just chose stylistically to have a bit more of a rounded shape to their A's. Again, here we're looking at, it gets a bit fat and a bit squished out around in this A here, which creates kind of an interesting look. Whereas this A here, you have a lot more circular when you come around that bend. I mean, where Helvetica lacks character in terms of like a interesting shape, and here it makes up for. And here, like that teardrop kind of shape is super nice where it lines up with that. Whereas this just goes for a flat, like a flat connection there. And so to me, I would say I prefer, if I was to look at an individual character here, I'd probably almost prefer this A just because of that super nice inset there. R's are pretty similar. I'd say there's not too much difference between the two of them there. Lowercase C's, again, this one's a lot more circular than this is. This is a bit more squished, rounded at the top, whereas this follows that kind of circle form. The T's, not a lot of difference. Maybe this T is just a bit more extended on here on the right than this T is here. Again, this is just stylistic choice to kind of differentiate it slightly from Helvetica. Again, yes, slightly more rounded.
Yeah,
pretty much the same. S, again, a bit more rounded and a bit more open up in these spaces than Helvetica is. It's a bit more condensed in amongst here. And then yeah, same. So the creator typographer who created this would literally have just been, his goal was to recreate Helvetica, but give it a bit more a character and a bit more friendliness, I would say, which is why I brought in those bit more circular nature to it instead of the flatness and some of those shapes, those characters. That cool? That answer your question?
Yeah. I guess there's like a million answers to that too, right?
Yeah, and to be honest, it's like just like the rest of the design, man. It's all like about stylistic choices and adding a bit of your own flavor and your own artwork too. It's like, for example, if I was to, when you were talking about your drawing class, you grab an image that's already there, but you look for the interesting things and you kind of work off that with your own style, to develop your own kind of story in amongst this image. It's the same with type. Like, it's already this great foundation in Helvetica, but I want to create something better, like a little bit more unique and a bit more like story to it. And so that's what's happened here. Cool. All right, I'm running out of time, so we better move on because I've talked for way too long on that stuff already. Sweet.
Yeah.
Okay, now we're going to get into like setting type. And so setting type is just the words basically for deciding how your type's going to look and function. You have 4 main kind of aspects that differentiate how you can manipulate type. You've got size, for example, and that's just the point size, which we can change up here. And most of it will look like that in every program you kind of use. But yeah, so size is the first thing that we can look at. Obviously, if I'm going to open up a page and it has this type here and it has this type here, where are my eyes drawn to naturally? Obviously, the bigger type. We've been trained to look at the bigger first, and it catches your appearance. So size is a hugely important thing when we're looking at creating a piece of design, in terms of hierarchy, and when we're trying to tell our story, like what needs our eyesight first, whatever it is, that thing needs to be the bigger type, and then the rest of the information can follow in a smaller type size. And we see this when we look at headings over body paragraphs. Sometimes headings will be a slightly bigger point size than the rest of the body copy. So that's the first way we can manipulate our type and how readers view it. The second way is leading. And so leading is the space in between the words. And that is just done up in here. This is this guy. And what that is, basically in the old typesetting days, they used to literally stick a bit of lead in between each of the type lines, just to open up some of the spaces. And so we carry on that word, but obviously we don't see it. Our computer does it for us. But yeah, so that opens up the space in between the lines. And when we look at something like this, where this is super open, this is super tight, this automatically gives us the feel that in terms of this section here looks a lot heavier and a lot denser. This section here looks a lot more like light, a bit more floaty. Neither of these are probably not leaded well, but I'm just showing you the difference between how leading can affect how we look at type. If we want to create a design that looks super heavy and super rough, super like in your face, a big bold type leaded tightly like that, that looks heavy, that looks dense, as opposed to something like that. If we were trying to make something that felt kind of grungy and a bit like a weight to it, we wouldn't lead it like that. We'd definitely do it something like that. But on the flip side, if we're wanting to make our design at work feel light, feel super open, super friendly, something like that could be utilized. So that's leading. Kerning. So kerning is the space in between each individual letter. And so some typefaces have really bad auto kerning. All the common ones and all the ones that are on your computer already, those ones will have probably a general good standard kerning. But ones you might download offline, like on DaFont or whatever you download fonts on, sometimes have terrible kerning done, and that's because when the typesetter created the typeface, they didn't spend the time afterwards going through each individual letter and setting the kerning level. So sometimes we might need to figure out and go through and kern our words. And what we want to achieve here is when you look at this word, it looks super disjointed. Like it almost could be, that could be almost a word of its own. It could be Helvetic, or it could be Helvetica, because that H is super open by itself. And so that word's actually really hard for our brain to kind of comprehend when we start to get big gaps coming in and then real tight gaps coming in like that. And that hinders actually our readability when it comes to reading a page. And so it's super important, especially with like headlines and big type, that we spend some time making sure that our spaces and the feel of our type is evenly weighted, like so. Just 5 minutes spent doing that might make your whole design like instantly way more clear and better communicated.
Hey, Joel.
Yeah, mate.
Is there like a golden ratio or something that's kind of like, if your font is like this size, then your kerning should be X, like in like max?
No, so
that, or is it just kind of how?
Nah, so kerning doesn't necessarily function in terms of have much relationship in terms of type size. Tracking potentially does. So tracking, which I haven't set up here, is this digit here, and what tracking is the space evenly spread out between all the letters. So it's like the word spacing almost. So when I do this, the whole word itself gets evenly spread out, and so that sometimes does. Like if I use it, that's more related to the weight though. Like if I was to set Helvetica in, say, thin and go 0, oh no, that's pretty tight as well. Helvetica is probably a bad example because it's so well set. But nah, there's not necessarily a ratio in terms of kerning and stuff, Rishi, to be honest. But tracking is another similar thing to kerning in terms of just setting out the whole word. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool.
But most of the time, like 0 is pretty good tracking for like if it's a typeface that's been set well. Like 0 will look pretty natural. Sometimes you might want to, if you view it as a bolder weight, sometimes it needs to be opened up a little bit to be a bit more readable. So it's like even 20 makes that a bit more palatable. So usually the relationship is between when you go a bit heavier with your weight of your font, then that usually means you probably need to open it up slightly just so that it doesn't look super dense and condensed. Is that cool? Cool. Any questions? Any other questions? No? Cool. All right. So that's the basic tools of actually setting type, and how we can kind of manipulate it to look its best. Our goal is to just make it look as uniform and as kind of, what's the word? I guess aesthetics is not the word, but that could be the word. But just to look as clean, as clear, and as like nothing out of place as possible. Type is something that shouldn't really, good type, when type is set well, it shouldn't really be noticed. It should actually just blend into the background. Like someone should read it and just not realize. Type is set bad when someone looks at something and go, well, it's a bit weird with that word, or that they stop and go, what's going wrong here? Like something's a bit hard to read. That's when you know your type's been set badly. But good type should not be noticed really. We're about to run out of time. What do we do here? Would you guys want to jump on another call, or do you want me to just wrap up here? What would be preferred? I've got like maybe
do another call.
Yeah, do another
10,
one.
Yeah, I got 20 minutes worth of more stuff that we can go over, which kind of ties everything together. So maybe we do another call, eh?
Yep.
All right, cool. Let's jump out of this one then now, and I'll set up a new call, and then I'll chuck it in. I mean, the link will probably be the same. I guess I just start a new call. So we'll give that a crack.
Sounds good.
Cool. Let me stop. In that, or like consciously unaware, but subconsciously within all of us, we understand the rules of typography and how it all works. And so when anyone's looking at a piece of a copy that's badly kerned, you will 100% realize, even if you don't necessarily realize. Do you get what I'm saying? it's a weird way of saying it, but basically,
Yeah,
like
that makes sense.
your mind will pick up on it. You'll realize it's a lot harder to read than a better kerned piece of type. So, but yeah, so when I'm kerning something, I'm kind of just like, I'm almost squint. I can sometimes squint a little bit and just look at, like, what I'm looking at is just kind of the spaces around each letter and how that kind of making sure it's kind of even. And so when we see, like, you know, that space around here and the T, like in here, it feels pretty similar in terms of the white space. You know, this and the E is a good example because it's next to two straight ones. Like that space in here and that space in here is pretty similar. Like that could probably be brought in a little bit. It's probably too much. You know, like now they're pretty even. You know, I could probably bring that V slightly in just to crunch up some of that space and make that more even. Those are pretty close. That, yeah, it's probably fine. That C and the A, I could probably bring the C slightly in, a couple notches. But what I'm just making sure is that over, like, one good rule that I learned when I was studying is that you kind of look at 3 letters at a time. So I'll block out, I'll only look at the H, the E, the L, and make sure that those 3 letters work well together. Then I'll kind of look at those 3 letters and make sure that that space is kind of working nicely. Then I'll look at those, so forth. And then I'll kind of take a step back, look at the whole word, and just see if anything kind of feels out of place. Like that's looking pretty uniform, pretty good. And so I'll just kind of leave it there. I don't want to play around too long. Otherwise you can start to, like, screw it up. So that's kind of how I go about kerning. But again, like, no one spends time kerning a body copy. Like I would only spend time if I was in a document, on the title, maybe on the in the, like, headings. I might spend some time kerning. But in terms of, like, words like this, there'd be no way. It'd be a waste of time. And you don't need to, because it's too small to even really pick up on it. Anyway, so that brings me to body copy. There are a few rules around kind of how we treat, like, what's a good width, how we do, like, how we should do paragraph breaks. Again, this is where leading kind of becomes super obvious. And so what I've done here is I've set up two paragraphs that are kind of the same width, same typeface, same point size even. So they're both 20-point type. But this block here, if you can see here, is 20 leading. And this one here is 24. So this is four points more open than this here. But look at the difference. Like this paragraph here is super dense and pretty hard to, like, go try and read. I mean, it's Lauren Olson, so you can't, it's placeholder text and it doesn't mean anything. But if you went to try and read that, you'd have a lot harder time than trying to read something like this. And that's purely just because of the space that we've created through leading. Again, the opposite is also true. If I was to open this up heaps, which books seem to actually usually have quite a bit more, well, most books that aren't necessarily done by type designers usually tend to have super open leading, like something that's like this. And most of the time it's okay, but like when you get a little bit too open like this, now that whole paragraph becomes a lot longer and a lot bigger in terms of size, but also becomes a bit more harder work for our eyes to kind of join the end here to the start here. And so when you become too open with your paragraph, it then actually also becomes quite tiresome on our eyes and actually becomes harder to read. It might look easier to read because it's a bit more open and the words are a bit easier to distinguish, but actually over time our eyes get more tired from reading something like this than it would something. I mean, this is still a little bit too tight, I'd say. But you know, that type there is probably looking a bit more actually readable than something like that. Even though you might seem like that's a bit easier to read, it's actually not. And something like that, your eyes will be less tired reading. So that's how leading, obviously, in motion and body copy can work. But in terms of when setting body copy, it's also really important in terms of width. Something like this is actually quite a long, quite wide in terms of width. And again, our eyes get tired by the time we get here, and then it's harder for us to go from here to here than it is, say, if the paragraph was something like that. This is a lot easier to we get through the lines a lot quicker, and it's a lot easier to join the connection from here to here. And so there's like a sweet spot when I was studying, like between in a line, preferably for a paragraph, each line should contain around 50 to 80 characters. So that gives us like maybe like that to about like that is usually the sweet spot in terms of like width of paragraph. And so when I'm designing, like I would never kind of set a paragraph to be as wide as that, purely because it actually becomes a lot more of a task for the viewer to kind of first and foremost read. They'll probably get bored or like get tired by the time they get to about here, and they might not even finish the rest of the paragraph. And so it's super important to consider width of our paragraphs when we're setting something up, again, to make it as readable and as clear as possible for our audience. Just because you have lots of type doesn't mean you necessarily have to format it like that. Like 2 columns, is also just as effective as a paragraph like that. You can get more copy in, even probably with 2 columns. So that's something to consider when we're handling like large amounts of copy, is that we want to be really careful with how wide we make these boxes, but also how much we how much we open it up. It's super important in terms of readability and respecting the viewer's eyes. And also we've actually been trained to kind of read this way, and so it's actually just benefit for us all to abide by those rules. So that's some general rules in terms of formatting body copy and width. Now I kind of want to move into, there's some more things I could touch base here in terms of like what looks good in terms of like paragraph breaks and what's best. Actually, we will do it briefly. So commonly we have there's a couple of ways people distinguish between paragraphs. You've got your classic return, your space return, where it's a full line basically drops and you get an empty space in there. That's probably the most common way people insinuate a paragraph. Another way is doing something like, I'll just do it briefly. Let's go 20 points, let's go 40 points. The use of indents. And so as a type designer and as a designer, I actually prefer to use this indent rule, purely because it makes your body copy feel a lot nicer, and a lot more like there's a lot more what's the word there? Continuity. There we go. We got there. A lot more continuity between the body copy than there is if I have lots of spaces between. And if there is copy that's written in lots of short paragraphs, say like something like that, having lots of enter and full return paragraphs becomes, again, tiresome for the reader to there's so much jumping and so much going on that it becomes actually a lot more harder to look at that compared to the indent before. This starts to become a lot more like, it feels a lot more cluttered. It feels a lot more, a bit busier. It feels, a bit like that. So there are things to consider like that. When you are writing or when you are presenting a large amount of copy, is what's actually going to best function my design here. Is it best that I actually make this all kind of joined and use indents to display my start of a new paragraph? But at the moment, like this is most of the time I'll try and do something like that with an indent. But again, that's purely up to the designer and up to what you're trying to communicate and how you're trying to communicate things. Yeah, a lot of books. I think when we read a lot of books, we will use this indent rule. It depends what writer you're reading. If you're reading someone like John Mark Comer, you'll get lots of little paragraphs like this, and you might like that when you're reading it, or you might hate it like I do. But yeah, again, it's up to the person. It's up to the preference. Moving on, that brings us to, I guess, hierarchy. And so, like I mentioned before, when we are designing something and when we're using type to express that and tell a story, hierarchy is what we're trying to achieve and bring someone along on a story. We're trying to communicate something and express it as clear as possible. And to tell a story, any story, it's all about taking someone along on the journey, on every important step of their story. So for a book, for example, you've got the first couple chapters always are establishing the where the setting's taking place, the characters, everything. The middle's usually like something bad goes wrong or a conflict or whatever, and the last part's always the resolve. There's this journey you got to take the audience on, and the same as for in design. Actually, when you open up a publication, when a viewer or audience opens up a publication, you want, as a designer, to take them on a journey from beginning to end, and you want to encapsulate them and their attention the whole time throughout. But if you were to just bombard them with big type all throughout this document, you're going to lose interest pretty quick. And so you do need to keep things, you really need to pay attention to hierarchy and where audiences are going to look. And so obviously the main ways of developing hierarchy are through some of the typesetting skills that I said before. So size is a big one. Weight of the typeface is a good one as well. So that's like your bolds or your semi bolds or your mediums. So the ones that are slightly thicker in weight. But also I guess those are two of them are the main ones. There are a few others in terms of like layout position, but we won't go over that today. Oh yeah, we won't go over that. And so that brings me to this page here. Like I've set everything here at the same size and at the same leading. And so on this page, I have my heading and I have my individual headings for this section of type, my heading for this section of type, and I have another set of body copy with its own heading, and I have like the little details of say this was a book, this was a double page spread, and I have my details here of like the page number and maybe it's like the title of the book. Now when the audience or whoever's reading this picks up the book, as a designer, I want to take them on a journey, like I said before, and usually that journey goes from heading to the first paragraph, and I want them to read throughout, and then maybe at the end they might pick up on the details. But really, these details here, if they didn't read, they wouldn't lose anything. So these guys don't actually really matter, apart from unless they wanted to know what number are they on. And in that case, they'll look for this content. But unless they're not looking for this content, I don't really care if they see this or not. This section, these guys, on the other hand, this is all super important in terms of the story that I'm telling and I'm trying to express to the reader. But as you see here, there's nothing. If I look at this page for the first time, I don't necessarily know where to look because everything's the same. I'm kind of like, I'm looking in the middle, I'm looking up here, and then I'm probably looking over here, and now I'm looking here. But obviously we want to control and we want to try and show the reader where to look first and take them on that journey throughout the page. And so when you compare it to something like this, now we kind of have a very much so more so defined journey to take the audience member on. Obviously because of the size and the weight of this, you're going to directly look here. And then from here, you're probably going to move down to, this heading here because it's a bit bolder. It stands out from the rest of the type here. From there, you're going to read that paragraph, and then instinctively, you're just going to move over to here. You know, this heading's going to draw your eye from here to here, and then you're going to read this content. From there, you might be drawn over to here, and then, you know, this is the heading for this section, and then you might read all of that. Again, you might just skip over this content, doesn't really matter. So I made it a bit smaller than the rest of the type. But if you were trying to find this, it's still big enough that you could find it and could read it. And so as a designer, this is that's the kind of journey we're trying to take people on, and distinguish them a clear path for them to kind of read. And so type is super important in doing that in any sort of design. You know, if you want them to instantly look at the heading or the headline, whatever it is, and then the additive content is always second nature. So going into, if I had got given lots of content from a client, for example, and I now have to create a piece of work, my instant thought process in my mind would be, okay, what's the most important thing that if someone picked this up and looked at it for 5 seconds and closed it, what is the most important thing I want to express to them in that 5 seconds that they got it? That's the thing I'm going to make the title. That's the thing I'm going to make big. That's the thing I'm going to make obvious. And then I ask myself the question, okay, if they have 2 minutes to kind of say it's a whole page full of work, they have 2 minutes to kind of, read over this page, what's the content then that actually I want them to kind of be able to digest? And so that's all this stuff. And I would format that to suit that. And then I'll ask myself at the end, if there's any content that the client or the reader or whoever it is that's opening this book could open the book and miss out on, and it not matter and it not hinder the story, what's that content? What's that stuff? Because that needs to take, the heading needs to take precedence. The main copy needs to take, the second place in the hierarchy, and then that other content kind of needs to take bottom shelf in terms of hierarchy of the page. And so you got to treat each element in each section as what it deserves. Does that make sense? I find it hard to get my words out, but thanks for being with me.
That's good, man.
Yeah. And so a common mistake that designers, or novice designers anyway, might make is that they put too many elements on a page to kind of share that story. And when you begin to add too many elements on a page in terms of how we're formatting type, it almost, it does the opposite. So you have this kind of under formatted where it's not going to distinguish. Then you have a good balance, but then you have the over formatted. And so this kind of, you run into the same problem as this. Instead of being understimulated, you're now overstimulated by the different formattings of type. And now you're just going to, again, you might know to look here, but then you're also getting confused by some of these headings, how this is formatted here. And then now I'm just lost and I don't know where to start or where to go. And so there is actually a good balance and a good sweet spot in terms of when we're looking at type and how to treat it. You don't want to have too many different typefaces on the same page. That's a good rule that I probably should have talked about. So when I'm doing heading styles, for example, or looking at one page, a common rule is that I don't want to have more than 2 typefaces on the same page. And so we've got obviously this typeface here, Times New Roman, and we've got it with Helvetica as well. But I don't want to, I wouldn't want to do is add another typeface in here, because now we've just got so many different elements going on already just by type choice that it becomes distracting. Let alone how we're handling headings differently, how we've got this kind of right aligned instead of left aligned. Now, if that's one thing if you leave today with one thing, let it be that you never ever right align type ever again. I'm going to make a sweeping statement like that. Purely because as Europeans and as the Western culture, we only ever read left to right. And so as a type, as a viewer, I want to make sure that my starting point on each line at the left is always at the same point. This is a lot easier to read and digest. then typeset like this, because now every time I get to the end of the sentence and my eye has to refresh to the new line, usually it always jump back to the same place, but just a couple mils down. But now when I'm reading this paragraph, I've got to try and find where the new line starts. And so you get this awkward in between moment where your brain's actually trying to figure out, okay, where does usually this line starts here, because throughout history, we've only really used that as a Western culture in terms of when we set type. But now my brain's got to try and figure out, and it goes against some of the embedded rules within my mind. I've got to figure out the starting point. And so type like this is, whenever I see type like this, I won't read it. And that's not a conscious decision. I might even try and start reading it. But I'll get 2 lines, 3 lines down, and I'll be like, oh man, I actually can't. And it might sound a little bit dramatic, but like, try and read that. It's a lot harder and a lot more tiresome and a lot more strenuous on your brain than it is to read something like that. And that's not hate or judgment towards people that will set type like that. That's just like, again, it is facts that's actually way harder to read than something like that. And of course, with every good rule, there are exceptions and time to break that rule. And so I do make a sweeping statement, but maybe there is some time and some, moments to set type right line. For example, when it's a word or a number or a word by itself, or a number in this case, I've right aligned it here instead of left aligned it. But again, numbers, that's kind of common practice on a page like that. Cool. That's all I kind of had planned to go through tonight. But does anyone have any questions around anything we've kind of talked about tonight? Because I was hoping this was going to be a bit more discussion based than me just talking all the time. But
yeah, no, that's good. Probably like you mentioned, like when we download fonts from like the font and all that.
Yep.
So why, like in a quick answer, like why would you never do that yourself?
I would never do that myself because most of the time, if a designer or a type designer is going to spend time creating a typeface, most of the time, for starters, if I want to use a typeface, I want to use a good one that's been set nicely, that's been, it's had time put into it and care and love put into it to create a typeface that functions really nicely, is easy to read, but also has some really nice forms and characteristics within the typeface. And to create a type like that takes time. And so most of the time, again, another general sweeping statement, most of the time, all free typefaces are free because they haven't had the time spent with care and love and setting them nicely for the user to actually use. And so I personally wouldn't, because there are usually typefaces out there already that have been created by, again, designers, people that put care and love into something, into their typeface, that will serve the same function and serve the same purpose better, or just as well, or just as good, and might have a similar feel and a similar aspect to them than a free font I could find online. And most of the time, those free fonts you can find online have been replicated from a typeface that might cost. But in saying that, like, there's been times where I have used a font from DeFont or like a free font, or a font that's like super cheap, and because it was, and most of the time those typefaces are more so the decorative ones, like this, that have a real obvious style and element to them. One case for that, where our design firm has kind of used a typeface like that, was one called Shark Soft Bites. And that was the typeface for years for one of our clients called the All Right campaign. And that was like you had to like really take care when using that, because you had to go through and like make sure all the letters were kerned properly and like done nicely, which, is less than ideal. Like ideally, I want to use a typeface that has already have a pretty good like kerning on it, already is set into it and everything like that, and handles nicely. So that's kind of like yeah, that's kind of that. Why? Is that cool?
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. Last thing, I went over briefly in my last tutorial about like the relationship between point size and leading size.
Yeah.
And Ben asked a question in that video about like, is there a relationship between the two? And again, this fits into your previous question, is that most good typefaces and most like typefaces done by type designers will usually work well at a 10 to 12 ratio, or whatever that is, like a 1 to 1.2 ratio. And that means, so if I was at 20 point in terms of type size, 24 leading is usually a good place to start for nice and like accurate leading.
Yeah.
And so I could swap to another typeface. I mean, I could probably just pick one, like I can just grab that. And we're gonna go bold, hold on. Let's go Avenir. So Avenir, like that, for instance, straight away, like that leading and size ratio is pretty good. And that's because someone's put care into actually developing a typeface that works well.
Yeah.
And so like that's another reason why. Yeah. It's because actually time and effort's been put into making the typeface work and with the rules that already kind of exist.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of what I had to share tonight. So unless you have any more questions, like that's kind of us. But obviously, like type is, I can't stress how important type actually is. And like I said before, it does actually, the difference between a novice and a graphic designer is the understanding of how important type is, I would say. You know, it's easy to hide bad typesetting by layout and by colors and by all the other design elements. But a good designer will actually make sure to go over and set all this type in the best way possible. And a reader will notice that whether they realize it or not. Like you will be able to you will notice good design and good type design from bad type design without even realizing. It will just be the fact that you find something harder to read or a bit less clear, and and so it is easy to get away with like getting out some good design without putting too much care into type sometimes, but actually most of the time you will get caught out. And so as a novice designer, for even myself, like there's been moments where I haven't handled and treated type with the care it deserves, and later on down the track it kind of bites you in the butt because you realize you look at something, you're like, oh man, that could have been way better than it is. It could have been way more effective than it was if I actually just spent an extra 10 minutes looking after the type. So it is super important, and especially in terms of like storytelling, because it is what creates hierarchy. That and in relationship with layout is the essence of design, I would say. Type and layout. So
I feel like it's creative, like especially when it comes to type design, it's creative, but at the same time, it's quite technical as well. Like
it's that's what I enjoy about it, is that it's actually super clinical. Like in lots of creative fields, there are no necessarily rules or like theories or kind of ingrained rules that you kind of have to abide by or should abide by. But with typography, there is kind of like a formula or an element to it. And so for someone that is quite like analytical and likes kind of getting things, the details and the things aligned and perfect, type is actually a really fun way of expressing some of those, something like your creativity in those realms. Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah. All right. Cool. So thanks for joining. I'm sure throughout the week we'll hear Ben, are you going to do another? You probably do another couple of tutorials, eh? You there?
I think I will. Yeah.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah, something. Yeah.
Yeah, I might even do one on layout next time, because even just going through tonight, I'm just like, layout is something that, along with type, is super important. So maybe we explore of how we can better handle and better treat and understand them, like layouts, and how we lay something.
Yeah, that'd be cool. I feel like, because that's whether people go to school or like work, they need to know like basic principles of layout.
Totally. Because I mean, again, you can have all your types sorted out, but if you've laid out your type boxes like super tight, like so, and like not much clear space in your layout, your type setting almost becomes redundant. So there are like definitely, that is another super important thing. So maybe we'll do something on layout within the next coming week or two. But yeah, thanks for joining, everyone. Appreciate your time.
Thanks, man.
And sorry I've talked for so long, but yeah,
Thanks,
type,
Joel.
how good. Yeah.
Thank you.
No worries. Thanks, guys.